She was a successful woman until one day she found herself in a wheelchair and out of her own life. He turned her silence into a weapon, forged her voice, rewrote her name, and became a hero. But she woke up and began to collect what was taken away: strength, truth, and evidence. Now everything he built will become a stage for her return. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. The room was full. Warm evening light poured through the glass walls, mingling with reflections from the golden chandeliers, as if the very air in the room had been created by the architecture. Everything seemed perfect: the music, the canapes, the soft rustle of dresses, and the subdued laughter of men in expensive suits. People held their glasses as extensions of their hands and spoke to each other as if they were part of an important equation. The lines, the proportions, the design, everything suggested how much thought had gone into this. The irony was that much of this evening, the building, the lighting, the logo on the velvet folders, even the invitation itself, had once been hers. Adeline Rivière sat in a wheelchair at the very edge of the room, close to the wide windows. There was no one near her. In the distance was a stage with white illuminated structures on a podium, on which were built models of new buildings: a multifunctional art center, a residential complex in Antwerp, a glass museum in Helsinki. All her brainchild. But today her name was not in a single press release. People passed by, some nodded politely, some did not recognize her at all. Some cast glances full of sympathy, others of restrained awkwardness. But no one stopped. Adeline looked at them without raising her chin, only with her eyes. These were her former employees, colleagues, partners, even clients. Those who for years admired her determination, taste, ability to build not just a building, but meaning. Now they were spectators of someone else's performance, in which her presence was only a silent background. In the center of the room, right next to the microphone, stood Ryan Gray, her husband. His voice sounded easy, confident, impeccably trained. He spoke with the same shade of charisma that once captivated her. Tall, tanned, with perfectly smooth gray hair at his temples, he kept the audience in focus. "Friends," he said, pausing, "today is a special evening, not only because we are celebrating 15 years of Rivière and Gray, but also because this is the beginning of a new era." He looked away. Adeline knew what was coming before he even made the gesture. There she was, Leah. Young, shiny, in a white dress that showed off her rounded belly. All heads turned, camera flashes flickered. Adeline didn't blink. She just gripped the armrests of her chair to keep herself from flinching. "Let me introduce you to Leah Sanders," Ryan continued, "the future mother of my child and the new creative director of our studio." The applause was polite, but there was something viscous in the room. It was as if someone had shouted at the wrong time in a library, but Ryan continued as if nothing had happened. He was the director of his own play, where everything from the camera angle to the pauses had been carefully rehearsed. Adeline didn't hear his words anymore. They dissolved into the hum. Other phrases were ringing inside her, phrases spoken back then, in what now seemed like a past life, in her studio, on nights when they had built concepts together, argued, painted on the walls. "You're a genius. I just know how to sell," he had said then. "I trust you," she had said in response. He really knew how to be her reflection. Until he turned into a mirror from which her silhouette had disappeared. It all started when he started taking over meetings, then key clients. Then she stopped signing contracts. First because she was in hospital after an accident. Then because the documents came with her signature, and then because no one asked. She was there, but she was unheard and unseen. The accident had happened at a construction site in the suburbs. The scaffolding had collapsed. An accident, they said then. But now, recalling the diagram she had checked the day before, Adeline was no longer sure. Who had insisted on cheaper fastenings? Who had sent the memo on her behalf? Who had profited from her disappearance? She spent the first weeks in a coma, then in a drug-induced sleep, then a long recovery, her body feeling alien and her mind foggy. The drugs were doing their job, too strong, too constant. The doctors said they needed it. Ryan kept saying, "I just want you not to suffer." And then, "I want you to rest." And then, "I want you not to worry." But at some point, Adeline realized she is not resting. She is being switched off. She is not sick. She is being isolated. She is not losing strength. She is being deprived of control. The return began with the first missed medicine, then with the second missed dose, then with the moment she tried to unclench her fingers, and they unclenched. Then with the first time she stood up, unsteadily, for a few seconds. But it was a start. And today, she sat in the chair, without a belt, without IVs, without pills, and watched, silently, but with an inner precision. She saw Leah take the microphone, spout platitudes about new breath, about the tactility of the future, about clean lines that had been furtively cut from Adeline's 10-year-old blueprints. She saw Ryan beam. He believed he had won. He believed that everything that had been Adeline was now his. He didn't know that she had known the truth for a long time, that she had copies of the bills, the phone records, the fake documents, and most importantly, a plan, not of revenge, but of liberation. She allowed herself to experience this evening to the end, like the last note of an old symphony before a new one begins. And when the glasses clinked again, when the toasts were made, when Leah posed for the press, Adeline turned to the exit. The wheels of the chair slid silently across the marble. Behind her, laughter. Ahead, silence. But in this silence she could already hear her breathing, even, her own, real. And that was the beginning. It had been raining for 3 days straight. It pounded the glass in time with the beating of her heart, which Adeline could increasingly hear, not with her ears, but inside her. The room resembled an exhibition hall, white walls, minimalism, a perfectly cleared space in which nothing interfered with thoughts except themselves. This style had once been her idea, a space for restoring consciousness, as she had told Ryan. Now she knew it was convenient. Convenient for hiding loneliness, erasing corners, weaning the eyes off color. A space without hooks, easier not to see, easier to forget who you are. She woke up earlier than usual. The first thing she felt was lightness, not physical. There was no cotton wool veil in her head, as if someone had lifted a layer of fog, and this clarity was frightening, too long awaited. For a few moments, she simply lay, listening to the house breathe. Footsteps rustled softly behind the wall. Justine. Slowly, carefully, as if trying not to wake her. But Adeline was no longer asleep. She moved her fingers. Her left hand was a little numb but alive. Her right hand was stronger. She clenched her fist, then unclenched it. She smiled, discreetly, so that no one would see. When Justine came in with the breakfast tray, Adeline was already sitting a little higher, propped up on her elbow. It was the first time in 2 weeks. Justine froze. "Good morning," she said, putting down the tray. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Adeline answered quietly. Her voice was hoarse, but firm. This was also a first. Justine didn't ask any unnecessary questions. She just nodded and sat down next to him. "I changed the dose a little," she said, as if by accident. "Your body was asking for less. I decided to listen to it, and not to the protocol." Adeline looked at her, straight, for the first time, truly, and nodded. "Thank you." Thus began her return. Every day it became clearer. Pieces of reality lined up in her head like an architectural drawing. First, the details. The lamp she and Ryan had once chosen at an exhibition in Milan. Then the names, Justine, Cora, Arthur, Thomas, and finally, the events. The accident, the signatures, Leah, the evening. Everything that had seemed like a dream came back to her as facts. She asked Justine to read the letters, old ones, new ones. From lawyers, from partners, letters that told her to get well soon, and then stopped talking altogether. Justine read them out loud, calmly, without emotion. Sometimes, stopping, she asked, "Should I continue?" Adeline answered, "Yes," because now she had to know everything. A week later, she asked for a mirror, not a small one, but a full one. When Justine brought it, Adeline stared at her reflection for a long time. Her face had changed, her skin was paler, there were shadows under her eyes, her cheekbones were sharper. But in her eyes, there was her, stubborn, real. The one who once started with blueprints on napkins. The one who wasn't afraid of projects where everything defied logic. The one Ryan had fallen in love with, and then tried to erase. In the second week, Justine called Arthur. He came in a gray coat with a box under his arm. He looked embarrassed, like a man who doesn't know whether his silence has been forgiven. I didn't know what was wrong with you. Ryan said you weren't ready to see anyone, that you didn't want contact. He spoke a lot for me, Adeline said quietly. Yes. Arthur looked down. Sorry, I should have come earlier. She silently extended her hand. He placed the box in it. Inside were documents. Drafts of projects with her name in brackets, crossed out. Final versions, signed by Leah. Transfers of funds, signatures. Some of them looked like hers, but she knew. They were fakes. Good ones, but fakes. I collected all this from the mail, and what leaked from the archive. They clean it, very carefully. But they don't have time for everything. Thank you. Arthur left, but he left the main material. Now she had evidence. Justine introduced her to Coral, a former lawyer and now an independent consultant. He came reluctantly. He expected, in his words, a psychologically unstable figure in a dressing gown, with a confused look in her eyes. What he found was a woman in a wool coat, sitting at a table with a plan of action. After 20 minutes of conversation, he said, "You don't just want revenge. You want your voice back. I want what he took away to be mine again, but not just on paper." Okay, then I'm with you. He started with the main thing, requesting old contracts, contacting notaries where the documents were certified. Fake powers of attorney and altered orders had already surfaced there. At the same time, he connected Thomas Leroy, a private detective with a solid reputation and a low voice. Thomas worked quickly. Within 2 weeks, he had a copy of a letter, purportedly from Adeline, about a change in the fastenings at the construction site just before the accident. The date matched the day she was in another country. The signature contained her name. The technical specifications contained savings, and then an insurance payment, which Ryan had used to expand the office. "If you'll excuse me," Thomas said, holding up the documents. "This isn't just a forgery. It could be classified as attempted mischief. If you hadn't survived..." "I survived." Adeline's voice dropped. "That means I have a chance to end this right." Now it all came down to one thing: collect, record, and wait for the moment. The blow had to be precise, not an accusation, but an exposure. She didn't need pity. She needed to prove that she hadn't disappeared, that she wasn't broken, that she was coming back. And her voice would be louder than all the words that had spoken for her. And every night, when Justine closed the door, Adeline was alone, in her room, alone with her plans, with a body that was learning to be a support again, and with a head that was learning to be a weapon again. Because the war for yourself didn't start in court. It started in silence, where you hear your name for the first time in a long time, and you're not afraid to say it. Night fell softly on the city, almost weightlessly, like a silken fabric covering the noise and anxiety. From the street came the muffled sounds of cars, distant footsteps, rare bursts of voices. The room was dark. Only the light of the table lamp picked out a piece of the table, papers, a tablet, and a palm clutching a pencil. Adeline sat, barely moving. In front of her was a blank page, not an architectural plan, not a blueprint. Just space for now. But in her head, lines were already lining up. Straight, clear, cold, like thoughts that she was no longer afraid to think. Justine came in quietly, as always. She brought a glass of water and a thin blanket. She didn't ask how things were. She didn't offer to lie down. She was just there, like a presence that didn't require words. "You're working again," she said quietly, more as a statement than a reproach. "Not work. Nervous system," Adeline replied. "When I paint, I feel alive again." Justine nodded. She had understood it all a week ago, when she had first seen Adeline hold a pen, with effort, but with determination. She had understood then that this woman was not just getting back on her feet, she was returning to a place where she could be dangerous, to those who thought she had been defeated. Meanwhile, Coral and Thomas moved quickly. Their goal was the same, to collect more than they needed, not just evidence, not just clues, but a pattern, a chain, a mosaic in which each piece fits together precisely and beyond doubt. Coral, always neat with a taut voice and eyes in which lived the coldness of analytics, called every day to check the progress. Today, he brought something new, a printout of correspondence between Leah and the company's financial director. Several letters in which she carefully hinted at upcoming transfers, at temporary substitutions, at the fact that signatures can be clarified post factum. Adeline reread every word, slowly, without emotion. She was no longer angry. She was collecting. Thomas, on the other hand, acted differently. He didn't say much. He just came in, put photos, flash drives, diagrams on the table. Once, there was CCTV footage of Leah entering the office when Adeline was already at the clinic. Another was a voice message, intercepted through a recorded connection, a fragment of a conversation between Leah and Ryan, in which she laughingly says, "You're sure she won't wake up in time, right? I don't want you to regret later that you didn't complete all the paperwork." Adeline listened to it 3 times. Then she simply closed her eyes, not because she couldn't stand it, but because she remembered it, forever. At the same time, she worked on her body. Every morning began with training. The first steps were painful, then standing against the wall, then slowly moving around the room. No one saw her crying in the bathroom when her legs refused to move after the first 5 minutes. No one heard her whisper to herself, "You will not fall." No one, except herself. But she moved, millimeter by millimeter. By the middle of the month, she was already walking confidently around the house. Confidently does not mean easily. But the main thing is without other people's hands. Justine watched her with the same expression with which a surgeon looks at a patient who has survived a difficult operation and is getting out of bed for the first time. "You still haven't said how you want to do it," she said one day when Adeline walked up to the table without support. "I want it all to happen that evening, for him to bring people himself, for him to gather this false pedestal around himself, and for him to collapse before everyone's eyes. It's a risk. It's control. The last time I didn't control, I lost everything." Coral agreed with her. He checked the legal part. The documents were ready, the evidence was collected, the materials could be handed over to the prosecutor's office even tomorrow. But she said, "No. First, the truth. Then, the trial." He did not argue. He simply handed the folder back. The date for the evening had already been set. The Riviere and Gray press office had issued invitations. Ryan planned to announce a brand overhaul and introduce Leah as creative director. Adeline received a copy of the invitation by chance at the old address. She smiled when she saw the font, her favorite, which he had once called too strict. Now it was part of a new era. In a meeting with Coral and Thomas, She laid out the plan. Coral shook his head. You're not just taking back his name. You're destroying everything he built. No, she replied. I'm just showing that it was all built on a lie. I'm not destroying it. I'm opening my eyes. Thomas asked, what if he breaks down? Then they will see this too. She knew it would hurt, that they would watch, that some would think it was a show. But for her, it was a cleansing. Not a public one, but an internal one. To never let someone take her voice again, her choice, her signature. In the last few days, she had been practicing walking in shoes, uncomfortable ones, high ones. First, for an hour, then for 2. She wanted to stand higher, not out of pride, out of principle. Because the night he introduced Leah, she was sitting below, and the next night, she would be standing, in front of him, in front of everyone. And when the evening came, not the one when he fell, but the one when she stood up, she was ready, without pills, without doctors, without fear. In the mirror is a woman, with straight shoulders, with eyes that no longer ask the question, why? There is only, what next? And she knew. There would be a finale, and she would write it herself, without co-authors. The guests had begun to arrive before the sun had set. The large house on the hill, once filled with ideas, models, glass models, and the smell of coffee and pencil shavings, had now been transformed into a party zone. The snow-white walls reflected the golden lights of the garlands. A string trio played in the hall by the piano, and gloved waiters carried trays with champagne, caviar, and miniature tartlets. Ryan had calculated everything, every element, every accent. The evening was to be a triumph of his new era, without the past, without Adeline. He stood by the window in a perfectly tailored suit, a glass in his hand, watching Leah in a long powder-colored dress, accepting compliments, laughing, making light gestures, as if she had been part of this scene for years. She was his new face. Soft, submissive, admiring. Her belly was already visible, and she did not hide it. On the contrary, she used it as an element of the game. The mother and muse of the new R&G, as she said in one of her interviews. Ryan nodded. He knew how to sell images, and today he was selling a new brand, without conflicts, without heavy architecture, as he called Adeline's projects, without her. People laughed, drank, discussed figures and trends. The press took pictures. Bloggers, influencers, even those who had previously shied away from business appeared, and now they were here, nearby, supporting the new course. Adeline pulled up to the house 10 minutes before Ryan was due to go on stage. The car stopped a little lower so she wouldn't be noticed right away. She got out alone, in a dark blue dress, simple but understatedly elegant. Her hair was sleekly pulled back, her makeup was neat, high heels. Her back was straight, not a shiver in her eyes. In her hands was a thin, black folder. The guards at the entrance did not recognize her at first. One of them wanted to politely stop her, but she said, Adeline Riviere, you're on the list. Or should I forward you Mr. Gray's personal letter? He froze. A second later, he nodded. He led her inside. She entered without further ado. And the whole room froze. Someone gasped. Someone stopped mid-sentence. A few glasses shook slightly in their hands. The music stopped. Ryan turned around, and at that moment his face became transparent for a moment. There was no fear in it. But there was what happens to a person who has seen a ghost. Adeline walked through the room, slowly, confidently. Past people who remembered her differently, sitting, muted, feeble. She didn't smile. She looked straight ahead. Some made way. Some bowed their heads. Some pretended to talk on the phone. Leah froze, her mouth half open, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Adeline stopped in front of the stage. No microphone, no speech sheet. Just stood up, "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was even but deep, audible to everyone. "Tonight is truly a special evening, because it's an evening of truth, and I invited you all to hear it, from the horse's mouth." Ryan tried to seize the initiative and stepped forward. "Adeline, you're at the wrong time. This isn't part of the program." "That's it," she said. And she pressed the small remote control hidden in her palm. Behind her, the screen came to life, the same one that had just shown the new projects. The inscription appeared on it: forms of lies, documents, records, testimonies. Someone gasped again. Someone sat up. Ryan turned pale. Documents started appearing on the screen: internal transfers of funds to Leah's account, contracts signed on Adeline's behalf during the days she was in rehab. An audio clip of Leah laughing. She won't wake up anyway, and if she does, it will be too late. A video file from a camera where Leah enters an office with an accessible electronic signature. A photo from the date when she is present at negotiations with clients, introducing herself as Adeline's deputy. The voices in the room fell silent completely. Someone was already filming what was happening on their phone. Someone was calling the press. The employees who knew the truth looked at Adeline as if she were a person who had been forgotten to be called a hero. She continued, "They told me I was sick, that I should keep quiet, that I was too tired to make decisions. But in reality, I was slowly being led away, first from the projects, then from the company, then from my own life." She took a step forward. "But I came back." Ryan stood still. He knew that every step he took now would only make things worse. His face was a mask. He tried to maintain a cold politeness, but his voice was already shaking. "This is a setup. You made this all up. This is a provocation. Your signature on the fake powers of attorney. Leah is your accomplice. We collected everything, and we handed it over to the prosecutor's office this morning. Now you are free. Tomorrow, not." At that moment, a man in a dark suit entered the room. No pathos, no badges. He approached Ryan, whispered something. He froze, nodded, slowly lowered his glass. Adeline looked at the guests. "I didn't come back to take revenge. I came back to remind, architecture is not only about buildings. It's about truth, about the foundation. If it's false, everything collapses." And she left, slowly, along the same trajectory as she had entered. People parted, but this time not out of fear, out of respect, out of shock, out of realization. Justine was waiting for her at the exit, with a quiet smile and the words, "Ideal design. Strength is in silence." Adeline looked at her. "And exactly. I just showed them the diagram. They understood it." In the car, on the way back, she didn't speak. She just looked out the window. The city lived as before. But everything had changed in her. She was no longer the woman who had been forgotten. She was the one who had reminded herself and others what truth looked like when it had its voice back. The first few days after the evening at the mansion were a strange mixture of silence and noise for Adeline. Outside, there was a wave. The media picked up the recording of her speech, and it spread across the internet under the hashtag Adeline's Voice. Her name appeared again in architectural columns, but this time not next to sketches of buildings, but next to headlines about courage, deception, and rebirth. Some admired, some whispered, "Why is she doing this so publicly?" Others were silent. But everyone saw. Adeline, waking up in her room, in the house that she finally considered hers again, felt nothing but a deep, even silence. Not empty, complete. She sat by the kitchen window, sipping hot ginger tea and watching the leaves in the yard slowly move in the morning breeze. The phone kept ringing. Journalists, former partners, stock analysts, even people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some were asking for meetings, some for apologies, some for new projects. She politely replied, Now is not the time. Because everything that needed to happen had already happened. The ending didn't require applause. Legally, the case moved forward without her. Coral's team filed all the documents with the court. Ryan was charged with forgery, breach of trust, and financial fraud. The lawyers tried to soften the case, talking about psychological pressure associated with a difficult period. But there were documents, signatures, and testimony against them. Leah was interrogated separately. She claimed that she didn't know, that she just trusted the one she loved, that she was following orders. Her tears during interrogations touched no one. She disappeared from the media as quickly as she appeared. Adeline didn't follow the meetings. She trusted Coral, and most importantly, she knew it wasn't about Ryan anymore. He was a symptom, not a diagnosis. Her real goal was deeper, to restore meaning to what he had destroyed. The first thing she did after that was return to her studio. It was sealed, physically and symbolically. The lock had been changed, the materials had been cleaned, the staff had been moved to the central office. But the room remained. The walls she had painted herself, the windows from which she had once seen the first dawns of her ideas. She went in alone, without journalists, without Justine, without a camera. It smelled of dust and something old inside. She walked around the room, ran her hand along the wall, then stood in the middle and simply closed her eyes. She felt the air remembering her, the silence returning to its owner. The next day, she made a decision. Officially liquidate Riviera Grey. Not sell it, not reform it, close it. Remove the name that would forever contain lies. Instead, she created a new structure, the Form of Freedom Foundation. It was not an architectural firm. It was a space for women who had been through manipulation, violence, and devaluation. There were no psychologists in white coats. There were walls that could be painted, rooms in which to sleep, write, and cry. There was light, and choice, and silence. Kind. Many people helped her. Lawyers, artists, teachers, former patients. She didn't ask. People came themselves, because they saw in her not only a woman who had defeated her husband, but a woman who had defeated muteness. One day, she returned to the construction site of the very center where everything had once collapsed. There was now a new project there, a domed building made of glass and light wood in the shape of an open palm. She had drawn its blueprint during her rehabilitation, half asleep. Back then, it was just a sketch on the back of a medical questionnaire. Now, a foundation. On opening day, Adeline didn't give a speech. She just stood in the corner and watched the first women come in. Some looked around, some cried, some held a child's hand. Adeline just walked up to the counter where the guest book was, picked up a pen, and wrote, "You are here. You are already strong." Her name was now heard in universities, in magazines, in blogs. Architecture students asked, "How did she do?" Adeline agreed to give a lecture one day. Just one. The room was quiet. Everyone was expecting something loud. But she started differently. "I didn't come to talk about betrayal. I came to talk about design. Architecture is not just about buildings. It's about how we build ourselves, layers, proportions, foundation. And if someone destroys your blueprint, you don't have to rebuild it. You can draw a new one." After the lecture, a girl approached her, thin, with anxious eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I lived in someone else's house. Now I want to build my own." Adeline nodded. "You've already started." Life hadn't become easy. There were days when the past would come crashing down on her. When dreams would come, collapsing beams, the rustle of voices, strange hands on her wrists. But now she knew how to wake up. Without fear. With a deep breath. With the understanding that this was no longer about her. On the last day of autumn, she visited the old mansion where it all began. The house was for sale. She walked through the empty rooms. The hall was unfurnished. There was dust on the floor. On the wall, a barely noticeable shadow from an old projector. She stood in the center and said out loud, "I forgive." Not because he deserved it, but because she finished. When she came out, the air smelled of frost and beginnings, warmth in her palms, freedom in her step. She was no longer a victim, a widow in life, a voice on a video. She was herself, and now no one could turn her off. Not with a pill, not with a fake contract, not with the smile of the one who once kissed her temple and said, "Without you, I am nothing." Now she knew, without herself, she would be nobody, and with herself, she was everything.